Hello and welcome to another episode of Finders Keepers, the podcast where we help you find the best keepers for your keeper and dynasty leagues. I'm your host Jordox, and I am very excited to say season 2025 has begun. That's right, opening round is in the rearview mirror. Well, half of it is. The other half will be played in round 3 and then round 24. It's a bit weird. It's a weird way to start the year. I guess we can blame Mother Nature, or we could blame the AFL for their weird opening round concept. But I'm not here to talk about the fixturing. I'm here to talk about the footy. And on today's episode of Finders Keepers, I'm going to go through my takeaways from the two games we saw on opening round, Sydney versus Hawthorn and GWS versus Collingwood. After we've gone through the games, I'm going to talk about what is probably my favourite part of keeper leagues, draft in general, but specifically keeper leagues, and that's trading. Trading in a keeper league is so nuanced and so different to a single season, for example. I love everything about it. I love making an offer, I love getting an offer, I love negotiating, and I really love it when a trade goes down in my league and you can have a look and say, who's the immediate winner and loser out of it? And then you can look back on a month's time, a year's time, many years' time, and just say, who won that trade in the long run? So I put the call out on X to say to you, the listener, let me know your best trade that you've ever pulled off, or a trade you've regretted. And yeah, I got a lot of good answers. I'm looking forward to going through them and analysing those trades for you, which we'll do later in the episode. But first, let's have a bit of a dive into the two games that we did see in opening round. And I'll go through them one by one. This isn't how I'm going to do the podcast during the year. I'm not going to go through game by game as a traditional round review. But I figured with this round only containing 2 games, I may as well do it that way this week. So Friday night, we did see the season open with a cracking game of footy, really. Sydney and Hawthorn, with Hawthorn prevailing in the end by a few goals. For anyone watching on KO or Fox Footy, we got our first look at the exclusive Fox Friday night commentary team. But that wasn't what was dominating on X on Friday night. No, everyone was talking about the scoreboard on the telecast, but everyone kept calling it a score bug. And I kept reading score bug. So I thought, all right, clearly everyone knows what a score bug is and I don't. So I jumped on and got a definition. It is the small digital graphic overlay on a television screen that displays the current score, time, yada, yada, yada. Small in the definition. There was nothing small about the score bug that was debuted on Friday night. But in all seriousness, I didn't think it was that big a deal. It was pretty big. I liked how the club name, the team name, had the colours of the team in it. I thought that was pretty cool. Anyway, no one really cares about that. We are here to talk about the Keeper League takeaways that I got from the game. And I guess the first one, which is dominating in the classic game as well, was the performance of Will Day. We've seen him play, well, we've seen him score like this before. I don't think we've ever quite seen him play like this before. So very exciting for owners. The thing about him and Newcombe that stood out was they seemed to spend a bit of time forward in that first half particularly. So I'm not sure if it was a case of instead of resting on the bench, they'd go forward, but it had great results. You know, Day had kicked 3 goals in the first half. I think Newcombe got a couple, possibly. I don't think it's going to be something that's going to get them forward status at any point. But it was interesting, so I'll be watching that in round 1. James Sicily was probably the other talking point for me. He's a guy I've sort of avoided in drafts and classic combos all pre-season just for the fear of him potentially going forward. And it took 3/4 of the season for it to happen. He went to the forward line in the last quarter, scored 18 points, and I think he kicked a goal, took some big marks, and played really well for him. So I reckon it's almost the worst case scenario if you're a Sicily owner, because if it was a clear role change that is more predictable, yes, the scoring will drop off, but at least he'd pick up forward status. And then maybe later in the year or next year, he'd go back to being, the high-scoring defender with forward status. But the fact that he did it in the game shows that they're going to do that sort of dependent on matchup, dependent on the state of the game and how they're looking. So I don't think he'll pick up forward status. And I think there'll be weeks where he plays 4 quarters in the back line and he'll score really well. There's just going to be a week where it's an important head-to-head and they send him forward and his scoring dries up and it costs you. So yeah, Sicily owners, don't panic, but yeah, you're going to be wanting the likes of Kausha to return to that side ASAP. Lloyd Meek. Holy hat. What a game that was from him up against Brodie Grundy, who was clearly underdone and, potentially shouldn't have played. But Meek he's really exciting. I think looking at the year, we're trying to pick who's the next group of rucks to dominate the comp. And clearly Cherry put his flag in the ground last year and he's going to be the man for a long time. But there's just some others that we're keeping our eyes out for. Tom De Koning is one, Jordan Sweet, Kieran Briggs. I was quite bullish on a Matthew Flynn at West Coast. Don't think that's going to happen at this stage. But Meek is very much a part of that group, and based on what I saw on Friday night, he could go past all of them. Not Cherry, but the other up-and-comers. He's at the perfect age. He's about to turn 27. His body's completely developed. And I actually really liked his groundwork. Like, it was a wet night at times, and a few times I saw him get the ball up, off the ground and get the handball out. So, yeah, he looked quite nimble. Very exciting for Meek owners. Don't imagine he'd be unowned anywhere. Now, the other really interesting thing from this game, from a Hawthorn perspective, was an injury, which is unfortunate, but injury does often turn into opportunity. James Worpel was playing really well, actually. He was scoring well and looked like he was going to have a good year. And look, he still might, but he's got a pretty nasty ankle injury. Not sure what the timeline on his return is at the moment, but he's out for the immediate to short term anyway. So what does that mean? I reckon there's a guy who I was a bit surprised didn't make the 23 for opening round, and spoke about him in the midfielder rankings in pre-season. And that's Josh Ward, a guy who I reckon coaches would have given up on potentially last year because he was a bit underwhelming. I reckon he comes straight in this week for Worpel and plays not necessarily the exact same role, because Ward is someone they do like to use on the outside, on the wing, but I think there's going to be opportunity for him at the coalface, Josh Ward. And yeah, he's someone, if he's still available, I'd be grabbing him and having a look this week. The other opportunity that will improve is for Cam McKenzie, who did play and had a pretty good amount of CBAs. And I thought looked pretty good in the game. He scored 75. He's a guy like Ward who has heaps of potential, heaps of fantasy pedigree, but just hasn't quite hit any sort of fantasy straps. But he's still so young. 2 of them are. So they're 2 guys I would definitely be looking at if they're available, and we'll see what they can do this week against Essendon. Over to the Sydney side of things, bit of a disappointing night for them, I guess, but they have had some injuries and they might just take a few weeks to really get rolling in 2025. One thing they've done that's different to last year is quite notable is Tom McCartan, the defender, has switched to the forward line. So that was clear from the start of the game. Didn't really set the world on fire. I've seen some, commentary in the media saying he doesn't really look like a natural forward, so he may end up going back again. But just interesting to see when those magnets flick over the summer. Not really any knock-on effect at this stage in a keeper sense. He wasn't relevant as a defender and certainly not as a forward, but just one who's going to look like having DPP in round 6. Nick Blakey looked unreal. I mean, he's one of those guys that is just brilliant to watch, but doesn't always, put it on the fantasy scoreboard. But I love watching him. I imagine if you own him, he'd be frustrating at times, but yeah, he looked unbelievable on the weekend. He scored 90, but I guess the big flag on that would be, well, not flag, more just to be considered, is he dominated the kick-ins for Sydney. So Sydney had 12 kick-ins on the night and he took 10 of them. And he played on 100% of the time, like a good lad. So what's that, 30 points direct from kick-ins? So it's a third of his total score. I just don't know if that's going to happen every week. It was quite interesting. You don't often see that, like one player getting such a huge share of the kick-ins. Matt Roberts had 1 kick-in, which is probably not quite what we were looking for, but still scored 104. And Jaden Popowski on X put up a tweet that showed some pretty good numbers about kick-ins aren't everything, because if you're not the one taking the kick-in, you could be the one receiving the kick-in, and 6 points is more than 3. So Roberts owners, you got exactly what you wanted in opening round, a ton, and yeah, he's set for a big year. Angus Sheldrick owners, on the other hand, would be a little disappointed. Well, maybe very disappointed. I mean, the stars really did align in the pre-season with Goulden going down, Mills going down, and Sheldrick having a cracking pre-season. So long-time owners or new drafters of him would have been very pumped to see him named. And yeah, he scored 32, was subbed out, I think, three-quarter time. Just looked a little bit out of his element, which is fair enough. It's been a long time since he's played an AFL game. I don't think he's in trouble in terms of his spot in the side. I know he didn't have a great showing, but with Taylor Adams getting the hamstring, not that they're like for like, I reckon he holds his spot, Sheldrick. So fingers crossed we get to see him again in round 1. And then the guy that came on for him, Tom Hanley, who, I'll be honest, was largely unknown in my mind, but sounds like he was a pretty handy midfielder before he was drafted to the Swans. And I thought he looked great. He came on in the last quarter. He was hard at the ball, scored 30 points. So he's pretty much scored what Sheldrick scored for the first 3 quarters. So, yeah, look, I'm not saying go jump on him straight away, but just keep an eye on him this week, because I reckon he'll get a full game, and I wouldn't be surprised if Sheldrick was the sub for round 1. The last one I'm going to talk about is a guy that's been around for a while, but hasn't really been relevant to us until now. Sam Wicks he's 25, so yeah, he's been in the system a long time. Has never averaged more than high 50s in his career, so yeah, never been on our radar, but played in the back line on Friday night off half back and scored 74, looked pretty okay in the role. And I think what stood out about him is more what happened after the game, with new coach Dean Cox giving him a nice rap in the post-game presser, saying he thought he did a great job. So that says to me he's going to be in that role for the short term at least. And with forward status, he's probably going to be unowned in most leagues. So he's probably a good shout for a pickup this week before round 1. And depending how your league has it set up, you may have waivers set, which you can do on the new Keeper AFL platform, which is awesome. Or if you're like most leagues, it's just free agency still, and you may have already grabbed him on Friday night watching the game. Over to Sunday, where we saw the Giants comfortably dispatch the Magpies in what was a bit of a cramp-off game. There was cramping left, right and centre. Very hot, very taxing conditions for the players, and I guess that's the risk you run playing games early in March, as we are doing. For the Giants, Toby Bedford was tagging Nick Dacos, which I guess wasn't unexpected, but I had heard pre-season Bedford might be released a bit more to just play a more natural ball-getting role. Yeah, forward status is really handy for him. And I guess if he's tagging, he's going to get the CBAs, but I do want to see him released a bit more. Connor Stone is another guy that's been talked about in pre-season, another guy with forward status. He played in the back line as expected, didn't score a heap, but the role looked okay, so I think there's potential for growth there. The big story, certainly, from a Giants point of view, was the injury to Kieran Briggs. Now, at this point, I don't have a lot of information other than what we saw in the game, which was he took a big hit to the head and was stretchered off and taken straight to hospital. So best case scenario is he's cleared of any neck damage, it's concussion, and he's back in a week or two. But obviously, if it's a longer term thing, then the question goes to who steps in from a fantasy perspective. They've got young Nick Madden on the list for a few years. He's 20. Could be a little early to throw him straight in. They might want to see some VFL form before they do that. But there is a chance we see it. And then the other guy they've got is Lockie Keith, who I guess could ruck a whole game if he had some help from Jake Riccardi, who will come back to the side at some point after his suspension. So yeah, there's nothing really clear there if Briggs is out long term, but certainly be stashing Nick Madden, because if it's not next week, we might see him sooner rather than later. Lockie Ash was a pretty popular guy in redrafts, I would have thought, and he's started 2025 like a house on fire. 125 he scored, bit of junk time at the end, certainly a score and performance Lockie Whitfield would be proud of. Whitfield's still there, but yeah, I reckon when he retires, whenever that may be, Ash is going to be pretty big. Jacob Ware is a guy that's been around for a long time. He was the starting sub. He came on after the Briggs injury, and I thought he looked pretty lively. Looked like a guy who's ready to take his opportunity and cement his spot in the side. James Leake finally got his opportunity. We saw him debut, and he was okay. He played a bit of a mix of forward and midfield, kicked his first goal, which is great. I guess the concern is he only had 54% time on ground, and I'm not sure what that would be down to, because they were already down the sub early in the game and it was a very hot, taxing game. Not sure why he spent so much time on the bench. So I think he holds his spot. I reckon he might be the sub next week though. And then finally for the Giants, pretty simple one. Finn Callahan owners rejoice. The big breakout gear may have arrived. He looked $1 million in this game. Did he look $17 million, as St Kilda would suggest? Well, maybe he did. He's going to be a ripper. So I know owners have had him for a while, have been waiting, and so far so good. Over to Collingwood, I'll be honest, there wasn't really a lot that stood out. Harry Perryman, the really popular name in pre-season, making the move across. He looked great playing midfield, scored 90. I think on another day he would have cracked the ton because he was scoring really well early, and then everyone sort of slowed down. And then the other thing really, the only other thing really was the Josh Dacos half-back role, which has been talked about a lot in pre-season, and that certainly looked to be very real. He didn't attend a single CBA and took a few kick-ins and looked really good. So I think DPP, defender status, is headed his way in round 6. And lastly, Darcy Cameron was huge. Top scorer for the game, and no surprises. Like he's a really good scoring ruck, and owners would be very happy. But I guess it is worth mentioning he was against Lockie Keith for most of the game, because that Briggs injury did happen pretty early on. So plenty of takeaways from the first 2 games of the year, and bring on round 1. 9 games. This was such a tease this weekend, so I can't wait for the season to really get started. And the important part is that the fantasy season will get started. So I know not all leagues will kick off in round 1, but the majority will. And that's when things are going to get really exciting. All right, so at the start of the episode, I talked about trading in keeper leagues and how I put the call out on X to the listeners to send through the best trades they've done, the worst trades, any trades that are going on at the moment in their leagues or to them. And I got a great response. So thank you to everyone that sent them in. Looking forward to going through them, which we will do now. The first one I've got is Daniel Bird at Vulcan Left Hand. And he says, I'm in a pretty active trading keeper league and I'm contending this year. Last year I traded Jared Berry and Willem Drew for Callum Mills and a 4th rounder, which I turned into Jack Bowes. Also traded Will Graham for a 10th rounder, which I turned into Stephen May. So firstly, the Berry and Drew for Mills and a 4th rounder, it's a great trade to pull off because it would have been done last year. Yeah, it was done last year when Callum Mills was out pretty much for the whole season. And it's interesting the value of players who are out for the year. So last year was a bit different with someone like a Bailey Smith who'd done his knee and looked like going to a new club and had forward status. But Callum Mills, I don't know, I felt like his currency really dropped as the year went on. And Daniel's done a great job here converting a couple of, handy guys in Berry and Drew for Mills and a nice pick in the 4th round. So obviously no short-term gains for Daniel in this one, but as this year rolled around with all the talk around Mills going back into the midfield, it's looking pretty good for you. So well done. Hang in there because I know Mills had the setback and now he's a few weeks away again, but I do think when he comes back he's going to be super valuable, especially with that defender status. The other trade, Graham for a 10th rounder, that's just your classic, trying to get as much currency from the guys you're going to delist as possible. And obviously Stephen May is a handy pickup. Daniel also went on to say he traded Witts, Moyle and Josh Kennedy for Gawn. Now, I don't know when this would have taken place because Kennedy's been retired for a few years. So perhaps he meant someone else. So let's just look at it as Witts and Moyle for Gawn. And I think this is a really good win-win. You get Gawn, who is coming off a career best year. I know he's no spring chicken, but he's the perfect ruck you want if you're contending this year. And then the other guy gets Witts and Moyle, the perfect handcuff. And I'm really big on Moyle. So that is a great win-win trade, which can happen. Sometimes we have to pick a winner. We feel like we have to pick a winner and a loser in a trade. Sometimes it is genuinely win-win, and I reckon that one is. The next one I've got is from @the_Carton_Blues. And it says, I've got Sanders, but I want a mainstay forward. Moore, Myers, Daniels, that sort of type. What's fair value? Sanders and a future 1st round? I reckon just hang on there with Sanders. I'm not convinced he loses forward status this year. Eventually he will. He'll be a mid only, but I wouldn't be surprised if he just gets eased into that midfield role this year. So maybe just hang on there. If you're adamant you got to trade, I reckon Sanders is pretty high currency. So Dylan Moore, yes, that's a pretty I reckon that's a pretty fair trade. I don't think you need to offer up a future first, maybe a trade, a draft to sweeten it, but certainly not a first. Sanders and a future first for Moore, I reckon you're paying way over, and I wouldn't be trading Sanders for a Myers or a Daniels. I think Dylan Moore's one I would, but again, Sanders is going to be a ripper midfielder down the track, so not sure about that one, but I don't know, you may have a heap of those gun mids ready to pop in the next few years and Sanders may not be required. Rudy That's Just Rude says, this is an interesting one. I don't know if this is legit or not, but anyway, he says, someone in my league traded away 10 years of 1st round draft picks for Nick Dacos. There were talks of the trade being vetoed by the league, but we wanted him to suffer the consequences of his own stupidity. And then he's gone on to tag @Eden Winter, who I'm presuming is the coach who now owns Nick Dacos. Look, I don't know. That's a fair deal, I guess. it's a little silly. I mean, if I was a commissioner in that league, I wouldn't allow that. Some coaches need to be protected from themselves. 10 years of first-round picks is just ridiculous. No player is worth that, even if it is Nick Dacos. And imagine the rivalry between those two sides now. One side owns the other side's first-round pick in every draft for the next decade. So they're just always going to be hoping they suck. At Bamboonies says, I sent DeGoey and Rayner for Oliver last season. Got nothing out of it last year, but hoping it pays off this year. So DeGoey and Cam Rayner for Oliver. I reckon that's an absolute steal. Done at a time where Oliver was at his lowest point, and I have to assume that was when he was, scoring. It was a game he scored in the 20s from memory. He was completely off it last year, Oliver, but DeGoey and Rayner, I don't know. DeGoey's handy. Rayner's been a bit of a tease for a long time. He's got the forward status. I reckon Bamboonies has done really well out of that, and as we approach round 1 of the next season, Oliver is looking like, I don't know if he's going to be back to his best, but I mean, I don't see why not. He's got a point to prove, and he's going to be big this year. Tyler Finlay at Weary Pels Fan says, last year I made a trade that eventually won me the Cash League Grand Final. I traded Tom Green, Sam Powell-Pepper and Jaden Hunt for Mateus Filippo, Jack Sinclair and Brad Crouch. The funniest part is the big 3 names are all out at the start of this season. That's a great trade. It's a big call to trade out Tom Green. And again, I wonder if this was... So it was last year. I wonder if this was at a time where Green was a little frustrating. I remember there was a long period he didn't hit the ton. So potentially you're a bit frustrated. But to get Filippo, who hadn't shown anything just yet, Jack Sinclair's a star, and then Brad Crouch, who, you weren't to know would be his last year. But I love that trade, and it's awesome that it won you a flag. Because at the end of the day, when you trade out a player, who goes on to be a superstar long term, like Tom Green will be, end of the day, you've got a flag. And great players are great, but winning the premiership is better. He also said, I've been offered Ollie Hollins for next year's 3rd round pick. It's always hard to sort of know the value of a pick because, you don't know how deep the league is. You don't know how competitive the league is. But I think on the surface, I'd be saying, don't do that. Ollie Hollins, I reckon, was tracking really well in his 2nd year as a winger. And now he's got what appears to be a halfback role, which will not only gain him defender status, but more fantasy points than he would have got if he stayed on the wing. I'd be holding Hollins or demanding more. This one's a ripper. At George de Guzman has written, at round 7, 2015, I traded Eddie Betts with a 3-round average of 106 to Taylor Adams, fresh off a couple of shockers. Love Eddie as a player, but Adams became one of my best fantasy players for the next 5 years, and to this day, my league mate has never lived this trade down. That is the best one. Awesome. I love, what's that, 10 years ago? So let's have a look. What did Adams average from 2015 onwards? So this potentially includes finals, but 101, 103, 115, 99, 94, 91, that's the COVID year, so what's that? I don't know, well over 100. 101, 80, and then it started to slow down. Brilliant. And Betts would have been great to have, but yeah, he was never going to be a fantasy gun. I don't know what I love more, that you remember the exact round that you made that trade, or the fact that you still give it to your mate all these years later. But to me, that's everything that's great about trades in Keeper. In the moment, it might have felt like a win-win, a month later, it might have been still win-win. And then the winds of time, we see that no, that wasn't win-win at all. That was that was a big win to you. Thanks for sending that in. That's my favourite one so far. And the last one we've got before we wrap up the episode, Stephen Smith at Stephen Smith 39612 says, last year the preseason games, Zach Fisher went off and I traded him for Luke Ryan. Brilliant trading. Jumping on a preseason game, building on the hype. There would have been salary cap hype for sure with Fisher 12 months ago. Bringing in Luke Ryan, who, has always been really good, but I guess could be a frustrating own. And then, we know what he did last year, Ryan. He had an unbelievable run, which I'm sure would have sent Stephen well up the ladder. And here we are 12 months later, and North brought in Caleb Daniel, and we're not sure if Zach Fisher is even going to be best 22 at this stage. And you've got Luke Ryan for another year, who's going to be really good again. So great trading. And a big thank you to you, Stephen, and everyone else that sent in their trades. That was really fun. And I asked for that for this episode, but keep sending them through, because I'd like to talk trades every episode. So keep sending them through. They were good fun. And that's the end of this episode of Finders Keepers, and the end of preseason, really, obviously, because the season started. But you know what I mean. Round 1 is about to arrive. So next week we'll have the first in-season episode of Finders Keepers, which will have more of a clear structure that will be the same week in, week out. We'll be looking at role changes, my top waiver picks, and trade talk. They're the three main sort of segments we're going to have from week to week. That episode will be out next week on Tuesday. I'm going to be releasing episodes on Tuesdays for the season proper, so make sure you've subscribed and you'll be able to listen to it the moment it's available. Don't forget as well, we are on X at FindKeepAFL, so make sure you're following and you'll be able to keep up to date with the latest on the podcast. But that's it for this week. Thank you for listening. Good luck in round 1. It's been a long wait, but hopefully you get a win first up. In the meantime, I'm Jordox. This has been Finders Keepers. And until next time, keep on keeping on.